Welcome once again to the book log, everybody. Today I am going to be talking about The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I think Toni Morrison is legitimately one of the greatest writers of all time. Like, just on a purely technical level, her ability to string words and sentences and paragraphs together in a way that is compelling and poetic is unparalleled because she's able to do it without sacrificing any precision or intelligibility. Her writing isn't too dense or inscrutable in any way, but it's still able to convey so much emotion and so much beauty. I don't really know how she does it. It's like a magic trick to me. I read Beloved a couple years ago, and it quickly became one of my favorite books of all time. Just a completely astonishing mixture of some of the greatest prose I've ever read, alongside one of the most harrowing and dark stories imaginable. Toni Morrison is able to get inside the emotional and psychological core of something so effortlessly, and she's able to write the most unspeakable pain with so much clarity and dignity and humanity. Again, her abilities are just kind of mind-blowing to me. Now, The Bluest Eye is a much different book than Beloved. There's certainly some thematic overlap to an extent, but Beloved is much more focused on the completely hellish nightmare of slavery in the United States, while The Bluest Eye is more concerned with the psychological and cultural violence of not just internalized racism, but the mechanisms through which internalized racism is instilled in the first place. Through things like dominant beauty standards that are reinforced by the media and culture, the way that politics and the economy are just structured, but also how it can be passed down and warped generationally through families and communities that were themselves shaped by those same forces. So the way this book works is that it unfolds largely through a series of flashbacks and vignettes that surround and relate to a little girl named Piccola. A lot of this book is narrated in the first person by a different little girl named Claudia, who lives in Toni Morrison's hometown of Lorain, Ohio, with her family. And Piccola actually lives with them as a temporary foster child because her house was burned down by her unstable, alcoholic, and sexually abusive father, Charlie, who also got his own daughter pregnant. So yeah. Piccola is a very quiet and withdrawn girl. She grows up in poverty. Both of her parents are constantly fighting each other, both emotionally and physically. Piccola is repeatedly made to feel ugly by almost everyone around her. Grown-ups in the neighborhood look down on her, kids at school bully her, and so in an attempt to transform herself and be seen differently, Piccola wishes for blue eyes, which she believes will make her beautiful and finally worthy of love. Obviously, this is just an incredibly sad premise, but Toni Morrison herself writes in the afterword that she wasn't necessarily trying to create this purely heartbreaking experience, even though it is easy to interpret it that way. She was trying to explore how a child could come to internalize that kind of self-hatred and to examine the forces that teach someone to see themselves as unworthy in the first place. And that's where a lot of the rest of this book comes into play, because even though the book is about Piccola and her wanting blue eyes, a large percentage of the actual page count here is dedicated to crafting these incredibly vivid and detailed and dark character portraits of other people in Piccola's life, or people that she encountered at one time or another. First, and maybe most importantly, there's Piccola's mother, Pauline. Through years of internalizing these dominant beauty standards through things like the movies and living within an extreme racial hierarchy, Pauline has developed this persistent belief that true love is an experience reserved for beautiful people, which in her world basically means white people. That is what makes someone worthy of affection and care, and because she sees herself as outside of that standard, she sees herself as ugly, she just accepts this feeling of unworthiness as the natural order of things, which is an attitude that also shapes how she behaves as a mother. Pauline works as a servant for a wealthy white family where she pours basically all of her emotional energy into maintaining their home, caring for their child, showing a tenderness and an attentiveness that she withholds from her own daughter. She has learned to associate cleanliness and beauty with whiteness and chaos or ugliness with blackness, which of course extends to her family. This is a major part of how Piccola developed her own inferiority complex. It's not Piccola's fault, it's not really even Pauline's fault. They have just internalized a system of values imposed on them and fully absorbed a worldview that teaches them to see themselves as unworthy. Interestingly, this whole section of the book alternates between third-person narration and first-person narration from Pauline herself. This is the only section of the book that's like this, and I think it's a very deliberate decision Toni Morrison is making. She uses the third-person sections to show Pauline kind of from the outside as someone shaped by these broad social forces she doesn't recognize, while the first-person sections let Pauline narrate her own life in her own voice to kind of show how she understands and she justifies those same experiences. Toni Morrison is just always operating on all these different levels. And that brings us to what I would say is the other most important character portrait in this book, which is Piccola's father, Charlie. Charlie's life and upbringing is also explored in quite a lot of detail here, and he is just such a dark and complicated and tragic character with both of Piccola's parents, but especially Charlie. It feels like Toni Morrison is tracing the origins of Piccola's internalized hatred back to its sources, showing how it's generational and recurring and how it proliferates through time. Charlie begins life abandoned, literally left behind by his parents and taken in by his Aunt Jimmy, who raises him. For a little while, he has some stability in his life, but it disappears when Aunt Jimmy dies, leaving him alone again. As a teenager, he experiences a very deeply traumatic and degrading and humiliating incident where he's being intimate with a girl he cares about when two white men with guns suddenly find them, and instead of leaving, they shine a light on them and threaten them to keep going while they stand there watching and laughing. From that point on, his life becomes a kind of aimless drift. He basically wanders around and drinks until he eventually meets Pauline. Their relationship is initially pretty healthy. They have Piccola, but it eventually deteriorates due to poverty and their own troubled pasts. And then, like I alluded to earlier, and also something that is foreshadowed pretty much on the first page of the book, there's a scene where Charlie rapes and impregnates Piccola. I think this is a troublesome aspect of this book for a lot of people because Toni Morrison is walking a really tight line of overly humanizing a character who would go on to commit this monstrous act. But I don't really think that's what she's doing. She portrays Charlie as a human being shaped by all of these forces of abandonment and racism and sexual trauma, someone whose behavior is rooted in real suffering and also just a really brutal historical context. But I don't think she ever allows that to become an excuse. The narrative does not soften what he does or shift responsibility away from him. It forces you to hold both things at once, that he is a product of immense damage and that he passes that damage on in a way that devastates someone even more vulnerable. I think it's supposed to make the tragedy deeper because it shows how these cycles of harm can continue on and on. The book ends with Piccola seeking the help of this really strange man named Soaphead Church, who is this sham spiritual healer type guy. And of course, Toni Morrison goes deep into his background as well. But Piccola asks Soaphead Church to help her obtain blue eyes, and he tricks her into feeding a dog poisoned meat by telling her that when the dog dies, Piccola's wish will be granted. This happens, which then kind of pushes Piccola over the edge psychologically. She believes that her wish has come true and that she does indeed now have the bluest eyes in the world. She has this imaginary dialogue with someone in her head where she worries whether people are jealous of her eyes or are deliberately avoiding looking at her. And it's basically to say that she's kind of lost it. And the whole ending is just so heavy because, as Claudia, who's still the narrator, points out, everyone in this community has basically used Piccola as a kind of emotional dumping ground. All the things people don't want to feel about themselves, their own feelings of ugliness, their insecurity about race or class, their shame, their fear, they project that all onto Piccola. It's like, at least I'm not her. Maureen Peel, for example, who's this kind of bully character from early in the book, her identity as a cute popular girl is in part dependent on Piccola being below her. There's a whole section about this woman named Geraldine who sees herself as really refined and proper, and when she sees Piccola, she immediately classifies her as other. Again, she's thinking, at least I'm not like that. When all the adults find out Piccola is pregnant, they talk about it with disgust and judgment, but no compassion. Condemning her makes them feel better about themselves in comparison. That's what Claudia realizes, because Piccola is poor and dark-skinned and isolated and quiet. She just absorbs everything. In the very beginning of the book, Claudia and her sister Frida know that Piccola is pregnant, and they have this sort of childish belief that if the marigolds they planted grow, then Piccola's baby will live. And if they don't grow, then they probably did something wrong. They didn't plant them right, or they didn't pray hard enough or something. But looking back, Claudia realizes it wasn't the seeds, it was the soil. This is obviously a metaphor for the environment of Piccola's life being so hostile that nothing could survive in it. And this is just one girl, but it's a product of a larger machine. A society that teaches people they are unworthy will eventually produce someone who believes it completely, and that belief can destroy them. I'm not saying it's a happy book. I think it's pretty amazing that The Bluest Eye was Toni Morrison's first novel, just coming out of the gate immediately with this supernatural ear for prose on top of a story that's so intricate and layered and borderline experimental and so emotionally intense and heavy. It feels somewhat slight when compared to something as monumental as Beloved, but it's hard to imagine a more more assured or incisive debut, one that already contains so much of what makes Toni Morrison one of the most essential writers ever. I think I'd give this book a 9.